sticking around. I suspect I can make up some time because what I wanted to do is really more start a discussion than just go through some details in that. My basic thrust of what I want to discuss is that we tend to think of 911 and NG911 as kind of a separate thing that's out there and that we need to finally get deployed, which is all true. But we should also look beyond the traditional notion of emergency calling, simply because there's a danger that if we don't do that, that we're inventing a system that really doesn't correspond to what consumers, what users, what first responders actually expect. So let's look at what I think has changed by perceptional reality in the past few years. So we have the traditional notion that 911, calling 911 was a big deal. You only did that when you're bleeding, when there was a bad guy in your house, or when your house was on fire. But anything short of that you did not call 911, and this was you touched, when dialing 911 made your heart race faster than it already did based on the emergency, because you're now, this is a big deal. But as we heard earlier today, apparently now people call 911 when they have a parking emergency, namely when they can't find parking at the Indy 500. So people's perception have changed. Also, after large-scale emergencies like hurricanes and earthquakes and so on, the only thing people know that at least should work is 911. So they're kind of in a bind, because if they have a tree that's blocking their street, which isn't maybe a classical lights and sirens type of emergency, well, who are they going to call? They don't really know, generally speaking, particularly if they suspect that their usual whatever that they might call the city or so, and nobody's going to answer the phone there. So they're kind of stuck. So I would argue that we've seen now a blending of the functions of 211. So everybody know what 211 is used for? Nope. Social services, not widely available, but it is available. So this is one reason, by the way. I mean, this is one problem you just illustrated. Is so supposedly 211 is for non-emergency informational, typically run by counties, as far as I know. Maybe some of you know better what the kind of a typical one is. So there's a county phone line you can call, and if so, if you need, let's say you need assistance with child care, or you need assistance, you need to find out how you can apply for food stamps or something like that. So then you would call 211. And 311, clearly typically a big city thing, where I believe almost all major U.S. cities now have some version of it, where you call a single line as opposed to trying to figure out which city department is responsible for whatever, for both informational purposes as well as to report nuisance type of issues like noise complaints, safety type things, construction site safety, and so on, and then obviously 911. But again, from a city perspective, it might be quite distinct. From a consumer perspective, I want to talk to somebody who can help me. And that helping may be sending a truck with a chainsaw, or it may be sending an ambulance, or it may be giving me information where I can find shelter after an emergency. So I think longer term, the whole notion of 911 as separate is probably due for a rethink. We also tend to think of 911 as an inbound only operation. Namely, I call 911 and I ask somebody to dispatch something, an emergency, one of the kind of typical 3 emergency services. But what also now happens is people call 911 for informational purposes. Again, particularly after large-scale disasters. They want to find out what should they do. Should they evacuate, particularly if it's getting late in that? Should they seek shelter? Where? What should they do after a disaster as to where should they go? Where can they get food and fuel and so on? So again, thinking of 911 as purely a kind of Uber for kind of an ancient version of Uber, like a taxi service for ambulances, is probably not the right model. Again, because that's the number of people would recognize. And the other one that we have is that we have an old model for alerts. This came up during the FCC presentation somewhat indirectly. Namely, we now say, okay, geo-targeting. Good idea. Let's not send out a county-wide alert that says there's a flash flood somewhere, but unless you live near the creek, there probably isn't a flash flood, even in a relatively constrained area. What you would want is something much more user kind of specific, namely, let's say this is again based on a large-scale emergency. I want something where it says, we're going to send a bus through your neighborhood to pick up people who can't or won't drive, to pick them up to go to your shelter, emergency shelter, and your pickup at your house will be at 9:30 a.m. Please be there. That is actionable information that might actually get somebody to evacuate as opposed to the generic, it's bad, get out of there. Okay? So again, and we just generally think of 911 as an audio mostly mode with a little bit of text, but we now should think of it as much more of a data integration mode that has a flexible means of transmitting all kinds of data, of receiving all kinds of ones. The other one is that we tend to think of 911 as a single agency type of thing. I mean, it is a dispatch center PSAP that dispatches multiple agencies, but we now also should think of it slightly more broadly, or actually significantly more broadly, namely that in particularly during large-scale emergencies, this is also a coordination entity for probably kind of mutual aid type of entities at neighboring towns and ones. Maybe, and this has become a bigger deal, I'll get back to that, is if citizens either have organized or want to provide assistance, the dispatcher should not just be able to dispatch the traditional kind of county or city first responders, but they might actually want to dispatch kind of a Cajun Navy type of people, the ones that organize themselves with boats to rescue people in non-life-threatening emergencies, but provide vital assistance. And they also would likely have to inform, like the media, as to what's going on. Yeah. So a much broader notion of a PSAP as opposed to just simply a front end to police, EMS, and fire. Then we have today a field communication by first responders that's largely kind of official land mobile radio and unofficially often by personal devices, people's cell phone. As in they find that they own cell phones. Google Maps is often better because it actually knows about traffic, for example, than just simply relying on the GIS system or CAD system to do that. So there's a lot of unofficial IT starting to go on at particularly smaller agencies simply because that's the way you get your job done. So we'll see a lot more apps. We saw that during the hackathon presentation, IoT type of devices, namely measuring flood levels and so on, UAVs, drones, all of those need to be integrated. And we clearly have to get away from the classical mode of every 15 to 20 years when the old system has finally gotten so bad that kind of a mayor gets involved or the governor gets involved and you finally have to replace it, you might want to do something more continuous upgrade model in that. And the requisition model doesn't support that. Our deployment models don't support that, but we need to get there because, again, this upgrade every 15 to 20 years when, basically you have no choice of in some sort or another because of compatibility or the vendor has gone bankrupt or no longer supports the hardware platform that's still there, whatever, then you have a problem. We can't continue to do that. So I believe that we should not just treat NG911 and all of that as, okay, well, we're going to upgrade, add maybe video to it or text or something, a little bit more data about users. Is we think as that how do citizens interact with their local community organizations in both ways. So we have a classical problem. Thank you for at least doing it earlier. I think you've handed this off if I got this right. So this is an example of a classical problem that we have in 911. Namely, and I mentioned it during the FCC presentation, the you first, know you type of debates. Namely, the carriers, whenever there's a new emergency 911 type of thing, whether it's location or text in this particular case, it's well, yeah, I mean, we are delighted, we offer new 911 capabilities, but the PSAPs don't actually support it, so why would you want to make us do that? And then the PSAPs say, well, if we implement it and it only works for, let's say, Verizon, it's going to confuse all of our users because they don't recognize that text only works for Verizon in this case, and it will just lead to more delay, possibly bad outcomes, all of that. So in that text in 911 case, for a variety of reasons, which I think had to do with more willingness to step on carrier toes and authority issues, as in the FCC has authority to regulate carriers, not PSAPs. There was a decision made in the text 911 case to force carriers to actually implement a step-by-step. First, they had to do at least a, we don't support it, and they had to actually support it about 3 years ago. And this was not uncontroversial. One of the sitting commissioners made exactly the argument that this was a really bad idea. We shouldn't do that. The commission shouldn't do that because the PSAPs weren't ready. So this was not like a universally accepted notion. I think with hindsight, I can't imagine that the alternative of waiting for PSAP would have gotten us to where we are, which is not great, any faster than what we are. So this is the August version of what Mike Fletcher used to do, but I think he handed off to, like I said, to a colleague, of tracking which PSAP support or about to support text to 911. You can see it's population-wise not too bad, but there's clearly whole states where not a single PSAP supports text to 911. So for reasons that I'm not privy to, there's probably a bunch of them. This is the thing that I was referring to earlier. This is from about a year plus ago. And namely, that carriers seem to have lost interest in actually supporting anything related to NG911, or had never had any interest in it to begin with. So it's kind of been a disappointing to observe that the carriers in one proceeding will say, we want to get out of TDM as fast as we possibly can. This is ancient legacy. You're holding us back if you make us do anything in transitioning to voice over IP. Anything you should do, you should enable us by removing regulatory barriers to move back to move to modern technology, get out of a museum technology. In the 911 proceedings, we have all said, well, we can't really interconnect with voice over IP to these ESINets. ESINets are really on carriers, so that we don't have any obligations to interconnect. And this is all not quite tested yet. And NINA and APCO can't get along. And man, you name it, they have any excuse under the sun to not connect via voice over IP or via NG911 protocols. In that, even though they run essentially the same protocol within their same network. So this is a problem. And waiting for insight seems to be one way to wait a lot longer for that. So this is, I think, one of the unspoken reasons why we don't have more NG911. And I think that does, not that the municipalities have always been fast, but they now seem to largely because their old stuff no longer works or is so outdated that they finally do need to upgrade after probably having done the last upgrade in the early 1990s when they transitioned to digital in some form or another, TDM digital as opposed to analog. And so that equipment is now end of life. So lots of places are upgrading, but they don't find anybody, as far as I know, maybe Comcast is an exception, somebody may know, is actually connecting via SIP to the PSAPs. We're all going through legacy gateways and who knows what else. So, disappointing. Yes? So it's through Legacy Alley. Yeah, I didn't quite acoustically get it, yeah.
Yeah, it includes
Okay. Something, I suppose. But so the other one I wanted to talk about, so I did have, since I didn't put a slide there because I didn't get a chance to do all the information. So you saw probably the cost model in this. Now, I will comment on the cost model. I have been surprised that there hasn't been more of a "are you kidding" response to this cost model. Namely, it assumes essentially a let's do the same old thing that we've been doing for 50 years and just run IP over it, with maybe a little bit of let's have a few fewer PSAPs around just to make it slightly more efficient in that. A few of us were talking yesterday at the reception and said, well, if somebody were to give any of us $1 billion, let alone $10 billion, for roughly 10,000 call taker stations, which is roughly what we're talking about, 15,000 or whatever, again, give everybody a new PC, that's 15 million in that, and for a $1,000 type of PC, you can give everybody a new desk and a new chair, and I'll take the remaining money and buy a centralized WebRTC, if you like, system that all you have to do is you plug your stupid new PC into, and stupid I mean this, and it doesn't actually do anything, okay, into a IP connection, preferably several for reliability, have some redundant data centers hosted by your usual suspects, preferably more than one of them, and you handle a few million calls a year, and you can do that all in one SIP server if you wanted to do that. This is not hard. Again, if somebody gives me $1 billion, I'm game. You just have to make the PSAPs actually want to do that. So I think we are too quick to accept this has to cost a ridiculous amount of money, which to me was basically well, this is so unrealistic. It could have been worse. I mean, I've heard worse numbers, but it is so high as a number that we can't do it realistically over any time scale at all. And to me, that is a failure of imagination, namely that we could do differently just because we've always done it in a certain way. And again, this is the getting out of a mode is talking about PSAP consolidation as consolidating org charts and offices versus consolidating technology. We can do one without necessarily doing the other in that because it's a lot easier to one would think to consolidate technology than it is to demote somebody from PSAP director to deputy PSAP director. And so that is a problem that we have this cost model, which I think is somewhat unrealistic. I have kind of skimmed through it. I haven't had a chance to go through it in detail. So if you have,
It's not that different from what you just said.
But it says pretty much the same thing, that it shouldn't be cost that much.
You know, a factor of 2 or 3 built into it.
Yes. Okay. That was for the legacy model, right? That was 12 billion. I mean, kind of for legacy, simple.
They looked at it a few different ways. Some people want to be on-prem, and for some reason I haven't been able to figure out the cloud-based model actually ends up being the most expensive, which is kind of very counterintuitive.
Right. Okay. So who had a model which was much lower price? I mean, I didn't get it. Was that in the official kind of
The official one was the one that
NHTSA? Yep.
there was the informal one that I did about a year ago.
Right. Yes. Yep. I've seen that one. Yes.
That also does include operational. That includes all circuits, in my case, 5 years, and DOTs for 10 years.
But that's, I mean, one of the things which I think is that by giving these numbers that include operational costs, it's not like they don't pay for circuits today. We're really kind of doing a apples to, whatever, kumquat type comparison, because we're not really taking into account that the current system isn't a freebie. I mean, the carriers aren't exactly giving their camera trunks away either. So, and that's so, but I do think we can do a lot cheaper, and we should aim for that. The model is how we get there is very different from the current model of doing even statewide RFIs and RFPs. We really would have to be a nationwide thing. A number of us has talked about that, kind of like the FirstNet model in some sense, where that one can argue about the outcome, but certainly at least we have a nationwide network as opposed to 50 individual state things in the end. Okay, so off my kind of soapbox for a second. The other one that I think we need to, and this is kind of a little bit on FirstNet in general, that we still collectively in kind of a emergency first responder discussion very much have a model of, we're now going to, old model LMR, new model FirstNet, long term, that's going to, once the capabilities are there, like peer-to-peer type communication, we're going to run just FirstNet, and maybe LMR will slowly fade out, at least in some jurisdictions that don't want to support both long term for costs and other reasons. And I think we have to kind of look a little bit more broadly, and this is motivated somewhat more by rural areas as well as other areas, and some of the LMR concerns. Namely, I think one of the concerns that people have is that FirstNet can never be everywhere, and given what we just experienced in the hurricane area, where if the cell network is blown over, it doesn't matter, packet priority isn't going to save you. No cell tower means no packets, regardless of what priority. And it would be interesting to see if AT&T had any FirstNet towers in those areas yet. If they somehow magically survived better, my sense is not. So I would be worried that the notion is either you're good under normal circumstance and you have nothing. But we can do better. IP-based communication actually allows us to do what we do routinely on cell phones. I suspect all of you, at least on your laptop, are using the free Wi-Fi as opposed to tethering to your phone at the moment. That's around here. And we have satellite communication that's relatively speaking, consumer satellite communication that's relatively speaking weatherproof and easy to set up in that. And we have mesh networks that we know how to now establish in that. And we have, in some cases, applications that we could design not to rely on networks at all, that rely on sneaker-net type of models, kind of a Humvee plus a USB stick model. And our communication system should be flexible enough to support that across. Clearly, you're not going to do voice communication by a USB stick, but you can do lots of the data stuff that we actually tend to care about in many cases, particularly post-disaster type thing, resource coordination, in ways that essentially work across this whole spectrum of what I would like to have to what I've put up with because that's all I got. So we've been working in a different project, not really related to emergency communication in the first responder sense, on something like that. So we have Columbia University and a bunch of others, we're working with BAE as the prime contractor. There's a project called DARPA Radix, which is a project which now has morphed to start a little differently. Something really bad has happened to the assumption, kind of a stage set, is something really bad has happened to the U.S. electric grid, and we need to rescue the grid by doing what's called black start, as in we need to restart the grid from scratch. This is an elaborate process, and you need communication to make that work. Largely actually voice communication, but also SCADA type communication in addition. So we are contributing to the voice part and some of the network management part to a network in a box, which is self-configuring. You can just plop it up. You can attach whatever communication links, and it uses long-range Wi-Fi links. It uses TV white space links. It uses just regular Wi-Fi type things. And it will automatically set up a network with a local Wi-Fi presence, so you can attach devices to it. It will separate networks, so it will provide network segregation, all of that self-configuring. So I see that as somewhat of a model you can imagine for that every fire truck and every rescue vehicle would have something. The hardware cost is really low. It's probably less than $1,000 per vehicle to actually set that up. And you get fog computing built in, if you want to use that term, so you can do local computation and local storage to do the kind of data on demand when you have intermittent connectivity. So you can do a lot of things because it offers computation and communication in the box. So there's actually a bunch of stuff depending on the TV white spaces let's see, actually thank you for the setup. So it depends on what distances you're talking about. So the ubiquity air fiber is one thing that's used, that the National Guard uses, is less than a mile, but it gives you a gigabit. And then 10 miles is like the ubiquity long distance type of thing on the 5 gigahertz band. A 25-mile gets you gets you kind of TV white spaces, and then you have VHF bases, which actually is now VHF modulation has improved past P25. Imagine that. So there are a company that I didn't know about here, this thing here. This does high bandwidth. It's called VHF MIMO, type of ultra MIMO. They do MIMO type of communication over VHF channels in that. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, again, we're talking, because VHF is limited to 50 watts, that's a car battery. That's not a generator. That's certainly, maybe not my car battery, but it's certainly a truck battery size in that. So that's not a major, I don't think that has been a problem. Because they use VHF, even if handheld, typically at 5 watts, but that's not nobody has said that that's in itself a problem. Yeah. Yeah, so that might be a problem, but indeed, but we can use, and then you can use, HF if you're truly desperate, but you have all these modern means that actually provide even acceptable bandwidth. So in 50 kilohertz of VHF bandwidth, they claim about 1 megabit, and under more limited circumstances in a narrow band, 64 kilobits in that. So quite reasonable bandwidth. Yes?
These are all good. Would you consider the CBRS band? There's just lots of product and research and trials going in the CBRS area. Would you consider that?
TV white space band?
No, CBRS.
DBRS, yeah.
3.5 gigahertz.
Yeah, no, that's not, there's a lot of trial there going on, and I suspect that's more future forward-looking because it is handset, yes. Yeah, and we have the question of power and all that. So the other one, like I said earlier, we are running out of time here, so that we need to think about how we better integrate information flows. Right now, we have essentially CAD systems that are slightly better versions of what your local black limousine service uses to dispatch cars, and it doesn't really do a whole lot. So in terms of actual smarts. But we have now natural language processing capabilities that we can bring to bear. We have sensor inputs. We have kind of data pipelines like the Apache Spark type of model. So we could actually produce a lot more include a lot more automation. So for example, automate the writing of sitreps and all of that type of stuff. And we are seeing some interesting developments which are driven purely by volunteers. This is volunteer rescue from a few I don't know when that was, from North Carolina hurricane, in that, namely where people can put in their rescue needs and then they'll put in how many adults they need and all of that. So probably looks much better than what most PSAPs have available and allows kind of crowdsourced rescue. I'm not arguing that this is great in and of itself. It has all kinds of potential problems, but it shows what is possible with relatively minimal IT effort. There's another good example, which I think is kind of, despite the difficulties that Puerto Rico had, it did actually do a reasonably good job, and this is clearly when things were looking up. This is a few days ago, a few weeks ago, and I screen pasted that, screen dumped that, but they have a really good status view that you can easily, on the media side, primarily see that, and I'm hoping that that's largely auto-generated. I think the notion that we should think of the 911 system as a homogeneous system or the emergency system is the notion of microservices seems really powerful for that, so that indeed hackers like the Tadahack type people could be drafted as necessary on short order, within a day or two, to write new services for that particular disaster that you didn't anticipate in that. And they should be able to do that in a way that doesn't interfere with existing services. So you can bring in short-term IT help or develop services in a day or two for very specific needs, as opposed to then always the standard thing is you fall back on Excel spreadsheets and even more mechanical versions in that. Okay, and that's it. So trying to show that we should think beyond NG911 as just 911 on IP as something that gives us opportunity, and that maybe the whole 911 model in and of itself, as opposed to making people feel bad when they call 911 for having a tree removed or being rescued off of a flooded home, maybe that illustrates that this is where we should get to, even if we can't really do that today, and it's a bad idea today, that maybe we should reflect kind of a citizen perspective on that long term and make systems work that support a much more generic and much more flexible notion of what emergency response is, as opposed to one that replicates what we did 50 years ago because of limitations that we had at that point. Thank you. Any questions before I get one off the stage? Yes.
Have you seen any real standardization behind what you're talking about, namely a consolidated view of all services, utility, any type of first response?
No.
Everybody's still living in a silo.
Everybody is living in their own little world in doing that, and clearly this is why I'm academia and not trying to make money in the real world. This is one where I think there's starting to be some recognition that there is that these are similar services which should be treated in some way, even if you end up having to delegate functions. The 311 model, on the positive side, I'm sure initially when Bloomberg did it in New York City and others, I'm sure the city agencies all said this is a horrible idea because the call gets answers by people who have no clue and they have no idea, so we'll just get talk transferred. It turns out, as far as I've been able to tell, at least in New York City, that almost all calls get answered pretty much at the call taker because they have tools, they have kind of FAQs equivalent, they have search engines that they can search for common things, and they can do the kind of thing that city agencies were never able to do, where you would kind of get passed from one kind of low-level staffer to the other, and eventually you would get dropped when you call. So I think 311 is an indication that you can integrate systems, but it does require leadership, and this probably requires even more so because you get the police union involved and what have you. So.